Hello and welcome to Business Standard. Here's a glimpse of the views expressed on the web pages of Business Standard this week. In his weekly column National Interest, Shekhar Gupta writes, "There are things a strongman leader never does, like admitting he has made a mistake. Three recent instances show that Prime Minister Narendra Modi, for the first time in 7 years, has blinked. 1. Modi's short televised address earlier this week to the nation was devoid of the characteristic claims and promises. 2. The government more or less announced everything former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was suggesting on vaccinations in his letter. 3. Modi cancelled the last leg of his Bengal campaign. These three instances show that Modi has realized the virus doesn't vote. It spreads sickness, misery, and death, irrespective of politics or faith," Gupta writes. In his weekly column for the Business Standard, T.N. Nayanan writes that the tax and spend catchphrase may become the new mantra. Interest rates are being kept lower than inflation as central banks have opened the tap and bloated their balance sheets. Governments too have opened the tap, and there is growing debate on new wealth taxes. The Modi government has steadily raised peak income tax rates, but has so far put down talk of taxing the wealth of the growing list of dollar billionaires. He further writes that higher tax rates, central banks pumping out cash, protection for home industry, suppressing interest rates, high social welfare payouts, all hark back to pre-Thatcher Reagan phase. Nayanan concludes by saying that governments are reassuming the primary role in building physical infrastructure and funding research, and even price control is back for vaccines. In his weekly column for the Business Standard, Mahesh Vyas takes a look at consumer sentiment towards discretionary spending. He says in March, when the RBI said that 12% of urban households had increased their spending on non-essentials and 59% had reduced it, the CMIE survey said 4% of urban households considered it to be a good time to buy consumer durables, and 54% said it was a worse time to buy consumer durables compared to a year ago. Both surveys tell us that the urban Indian household continues to remain wary of making non-essential or discretionary expenses. Vyas says, till this wariness continues, economic recovery will remain elusive. The lockdown restrictions that are imposed on e-commerce companies don't make sense, writes A.K. Bhattacharya in a column for Business Standard. The argument seems to be that if physical stores cannot remain open during the curfew hours, e-commerce companies too should be barred from supplying goods to their customers. There is no logic in such thinking. Why can't a customer place their orders online and the delivery person can supply the goods in a safe way at the address provided? Every business has certain inherent advantages and disadvantages. Policy must recognize them and tweak their enforcement appropriately, writes Bhattacharya. In a column for Business Standard, Shankar Acharya reflects on contributing to a briefing paper entitled Conflict in East Pakistan, Background and Prospects as a graduate student at Harvard University 50 years ago. The draft summarized the long history of economic and political discrimination suffered by East Pakistan at the hands of the Pakistani government. The paper was sent to heads of key US and international development agencies and eventually found its way into the US congressional record. A year or so after the liberation of Dhaka by the Indian Army in December 1971, the paper was included in a volume called Bangladesh Documents, published by our Ministry of External Affairs. As a graduate student, he says, it was good to have been in touching distance of such a significant event in the Indian subcontinent. Premveer Das writes, just recently, an American warship went through the waters in India's Lakshadweep area, falling within our Exclusive Economic Zone or EEZ. The warship was on passage from the Persian Gulf to the Malacca Straits in its normal deployment, but its superiors chose to call it a Freedom of Navigation Operation or FONOPS. The US Freedom of Navigation program challenges what the US considers to be excessive territorial claims on the world's oceans and airspace. Treating the routine passage of one of its warships through the Indian Exclusive Economic Zone as FONOPS could not have been an off-the-cuff action. We should analyze it carefully. Movement of naval forces at sea is often more than just routine deployment. Reading the messages they send is important, Das writes. Are Indian company boards too meek when dealing with the state, asks Amit Tandon in a column for Business Standard. Companies have shareholders to think about, and the state controls far too many levers for them to risk doing so. But corporations do speak, although in closed rooms, on policies that impact their business and publicly when they litigate against the government. So surely they can speak on issues that affect the society in which they operate. Such issues include the size of the fiscal deficit, spending on healthcare, quality of education, and so on. Politicians are prickly when in power, but this cannot be an excuse for holding back. Companies must speak up. They owe it to their future generations, writes Tandon. The successful test flight of the Ingenuity helicopter on Mars brings a new era for space exploration, writes Business Standard in an editorial. Planets like Mars can be explored much quicker by air than by ground vehicles like rovers. This could also result in significant advances in high altitude helicopter connectivity on Earth itself. The Ingenuity is a 2-kilogram drone. It flew for 40 seconds at a height of 3 meters above the Martian surface. Those statistics hardly convey the range of engineering problems NASA solved to get Ingenuity airborne, the editorial says. Business Standard writes in an editorial that professional forecasters have started revising their growth forecast for the current year due to the second wave of COVID-19. Many brokerages have started downgrading growth projections to as low as 10% on local lockdowns disrupting overall demand and supply and threatening the fragile recovery. The latest revenue collection data suggested that economic activity was recovering at a faster than anticipated rate, with tax collections exceeding the revised estimates for the last fiscal year. But the ground reality has changed significantly over the last few weeks and could once again unsettle budget calculations, the editorial says. Business Standard writes in an editorial that it's welcome news that the Union government has finally begun to consider what is required to scale up the availability and production of vaccines within the country. Broadening the vaccine supply chain should have been a priority from the start, and it is unfortunate that the government did not take an active interest in doing so. Unlike those in most other countries with pharmaceutical industries like India, the editorial says. Business Standard writes in an editorial that the Election Commission should have accepted the demands from political parties to merge the remaining 3 phases of the West Bengal election. The Election Commission has so far turned down this request without explanation. Between April 6th and 19th, when 3 phases of the election had been held, Bengal added over 72,000 COVID-19 cases, and like elsewhere in India, the state's medical infrastructure is overstretched. If concern for COVID encouraged the EC to curb campaigns, it's not clear why the same reason could not encourage its machinery to merge the remaining phases, the editorial says.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.